This screencast discusses the spinal cord and the associated spinal nerves. These topics may be found in Chapter 7 of your textbook. This screencast was designed to help you achieve the following objectives. Describe the structure of the spinal cord. Describe the two main functions of the spinal cord. Describe the components of the gray and white matter of the spinal cord. And describe spinal nerves, dorsal and ventral rami, and a plexus. The spinal cord is a collection of nervous tissue that extends from the medulla oblongata to about the 12th thoracic vertebrae. Below T12, spinal nerves extend and they resemble a horse's tail and are therefore referred to as the quada equina. There are two enlarged areas of the spinal cord where there are large numbers of motor neurons. The cervical enlargement contains motor neurons that serve the upper limbs, and the lumbar enlargement contains motor neurons that serve the lower limbs. The spinal cord has two main functions. One is the generation of reflexes. The spinal cord receives sensory input from the peripheral nervous system, integrates it, and then generates an involuntary response. Two, the spinal cord acts as a pathway for carrying sensory signals from the peripheral nervous system to the brain, and also for carrying motor signals from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. The gray matter of the spinal cord consists mainly of cell bodies and unmyelinated axons. This figure illustrates the components of the gray matter of the spinal cord, the unmyelinated axons of the sensory neuron shown in blue, the cell body and unmyelinated axon of the interneuron shown in red, and the cell body of the motor neuron shown in green. The white matter of the spinal cord surrounds the gray matter and consists of myelinated axons. These axons are sending motor and sensory impulses up and down the spinal cord. The spinal cord, like the brain, is protected by a series of fibrous connective tissue membranes called meninges. There are three of them. The dura mater is the outermost, toughest meninge. It literally means tough mother. Deep to that is the arachnoid. It resembles a spider's web, and that's where its name is derived from, arachnia meaning spider-like. And the innermost layer is the pia mater. I often tell students to remember DAP to remember the order of the meninges. For the most part, these meninges of the spinal cord are continuous with meninges of the brain, the biggest difference being that in the brain, the dura mater is attached to the cranial bones. However, there is a space filled with fat between the dura mater and the bones of the vertebrae, and this is referred to as the epidural space. Physicians inject anesthetic drugs into the epidural space when a woman in labor is given an epidural. I should also mention that inflammation of the meninges, typically due to infection, is referred to as meningitis. When it's specifically the meninges of the spinal cord, it is referred to as spinal meningitis. Now that we have discussed the spinal cord, I'd like to shift our focus to the spinal nerves. However, I want to be very clear that the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and the spinal nerves and associated ganglia are in the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord proper. So all structures that are lateral to these black lines are in the peripheral nervous system. Recall that a ganglion is a cluster of neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Also note or recall that a bundle of axons in the peripheral nervous system is a nerve. So the dorsal root ganglion is in the peripheral nervous system. The dorsal root is in the peripheral nervous system, as is the ventral root. The spinal nerve is formed by the merging of the dorsal and ventral roots. Let's take a moment to look at the components of a spinal nerve just to be sure that we understand what a spinal nerve is. This fat structure here, the dorsal root ganglion, contains sensory neurons, or the cell bodies of sensory neurons. Recall that a ganglion is a cluster of neuron cell bodies. The dorsal root contains the sensory fibers of these sensory neurons, which are transmitting sensory impulses to the spinal cord. The ventral root contains the motor fibers that are sending motor signals from the motor neurons of the spinal cord out to an effector, a gland or muscle cell. Where the sensory fibers and motor fibers are bundled together, they form the spinal nerve. Therefore, all spinal nerves are mixed nerves since they contain both sensory and motor fibers. There are 31 pair of spinal nerves. They are named according to the vertebrae superior to their point of entry or exit to or from the vertebral canal. And each spinal nerve serves a particular anatomical site. For example, when you touch an object with your index finger, sensory impulses from sensory receptors in the skin of your index finger enter the spinal cord through some 3 or 4 specific spinal nerves. Spinal nerves are very short and they soon divide after leaving the spinal canal. They divide into a dorsal ramus, which serves the skin and muscles of the posterior trunk, and they have a ventral ramus, which extends to the anterior or ventral side of the body, where it forms a complex network of nerves called a plexus. Peripheral nerves extend from the plexuses to serve different parts of the body. The plexuses are named after the region of the body where they are formed. The cervical plexus serves the posterior head, neck, upper part of the shoulder, and diaphragm. In fact, a very important nerve called the phrenic nerve extends from the cervical plexus to control the diaphragm. Neck injuries, particularly when one has a broken neck, one of the biggest concerns is severing the phrenic nerve, because if the phrenic nerve is severed, the person loses the ability to effectively breathe. The brachial plexus serves the upper limb and some neck and shoulder muscles. The lumbar plexus serves the abdominal wall, parts of the lower limb, and external genitalia. The sacral plexus serves the buttocks, the internal genitalia, the anus, and parts of the lower limb. I want to note that there is no thoracic plexus. Instead, individual intercostal nerves enter the intercostal spaces between the ribs. Let's review the objectives of this screencast. Describe the structure of the spinal cord. Describe the 2 main functions of the spinal cord. Describe the components of the gray and white matter of the spinal cord. Describe spinal nerves, dorsal and ventral rami, and a plexus. The topic of the next screencast is the autonomic nervous system.